Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard, and welcome to this introduction to IDL Interviewing. Integral Deep Listening, or IDL, is a disciplined method of interviewing perspectives that arise in dreams, nightmares, life issues, and transpersonal experiences. These perspectives may appear as people, animals, objects, forces, emotions, or abstract presences. Rather than interpreting them symbolically or pathologizing them psychologically, IDL invites us to become these perspectives and listen directly from their point of view. IDL interviewing is both simple and radical. It is simple because it relies on direct phenomenological inquiry. It is radical because it suspends many assumptions we normally bring to inner work about identity, meaning, agency, and even reality itself. As you move through this presentation, you will occasionally be asked to do a reality check. Pause and think what you have heard and how it relates to your life. This will help you move from abstract knowledge to concrete relevance. Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard, and welcome to this introduction to IDL Interviewing. Integral Deep Listening, or IDL, is a disciplined method of interviewing perspectives that arise in dreams, nightmares, life issues, and transpersonal experiences. These perspectives may appear as people, animals, objects, forces, emotions, or abstract presences. Rather than interpreting them symbolically or pathologizing them psychologically, IDL invites us to become these perspectives and listen directly from their point of view. IDL interviewing is both simple and radical. It is simple because it relies on direct phenomenological inquiry. It is radical because it suspends many assumptions we normally bring to inner work about identity, meaning, agency, or even reality itself. As you move through this presentation, you will occasionally be asked to do a reality check. Pause and think what you have heard and how it relates to your life. This will help you move from abstract knowledge to concrete relevance. IDL interviewing is fundamentally phenomenological. That means it focuses on direct experience rather than interpretation, explanation, or theory. Before an interview begins, assumptions about what an experience means or represents are explicitly surfaced and then set aside. Only those assumptions necessary for the method itself are retained. This bracketing of assumptions allows interviewed perspectives to speak for themselves. The goal is not to confirm the subject's beliefs nor the interviewer's theories, but to discover what emerges when interpretation is temporarily suspended. A defining feature of IDL interviewing is the suspension of waking identity. Instead of asking questions about an experience, the subject becomes the experience and answers questions from its perspective. This may involve becoming a dream character, a symptom, a nightmare figure, a life issue, or even an abstract presence. This shift is not role-playing or imagination in the casual sense. Role-playing implies remaining oneself and putting on a persona. IDL interviewing is about letting go of oneself and fully becoming the other. IDL interviewing is a disciplined act of identification that allows an alternative worldview to emerge. It is more akin to the descent of a muse in ancient Greek thought than to role-playing. The answers come from within that perspective, not from waking personality attempting to interpret it. Here's your first reality check. You've just been introduced to integral deep listening as a phenomenological practice, not a theory to agree with or reject, but a method to be entered. IDL begins by setting aside as much as possible the reflex to interpret. Instead of asking what an experience represents, symbolizes, or means, the method invites you to encounter it directly, to allow it to speak from its own point of view. This requires a temporary suspension of familiar assumptions about identity, agency, and explanation. This is why IDL interviewing is described as both simple and radical. Simple because it relies on direct experience, and radical because it asks you to release the usual stance of observer and analyst and instead become what is being interviewed. At this moment, pause and notice how this lands for you. Rather than evaluating whether this approach makes sense intellectually, reflect on how it contrasts with the ways you usually relate to inner experiences. When something troubling, confusing, or compelling arises in your life, a dream image, an emotion, a recurring thought, a bodily sensation, do you normally analyze it, manage it, interpret it, or try to fix it? IDL offers a different move, identification instead of interpretation. This is not role-playing nor imaginative pretense. It is a disciplined act of identification in which waking identity is temporarily set aside so that another perspective can speak. The answers that emerge are not constructed by the rational mind. They arise from within the lived standpoint of the experience itself. For this reality check, briefly reflect on your own life. Notice whether there is a dream image, life issue, emotional pattern, or recurring inner experience that you typically approach about rather than from its perspective. Consider how it might change your relationship to that experience if, instead of interpreting it, you allowed yourself to become it, even briefly, and listen from its point of view. There is no right answer here. The purpose is not to solve anything, but to register the difference between understanding IDL as an idea and sensing what it might mean as a lived practice. When you're ready, record or write your reflection, and then continue. IDL does not assume that interviewed perspectives are parts of the self, as in many psychological models. Nor does it assume that they are independent, autonomous entities, as in shamanic or spiritual traditions. Both assumptions are considered projections, unless demonstrated phenomenologically. Instead, IDL allows interviewed perspectives to define themselves. Some may identify as aspects of the person, others may not. Some may reject identity altogether. The method remains neutral, privileging direct testimony over theoretical interpretation. IDL is grounded primarily in evolutionary theory, systems theory, and chaos theory, rather than psychology. Psychology, while useful, is culturally situated and historically contingent. Evolutionary principles, by contrast, describe processes that persist across time, culture, and species. From an IDL perspective, anything that endures, biologically, psychologically, or culturally, must conform to evolutionary principles. Therefore, an approach rooted in evolution is more likely to balance adaptation and development over the long term. In this section, you've heard a careful distinction that sits at the heart of integral deep listening. IDL does not begin by deciding what an inner experience is. It does not assume that an interviewed perspective is a fragment of the self, as many psychological models do. Nor does it assume that it is an autonomous entity, as is common in spiritual or shamanic frameworks. Both positions are treated as interpretations, not truths, unless they are demonstrated through direct experience. This neutrality is deliberate. IDL takes the position that when we impose a framework too early, we stop listening. Psychological language, spiritual language, and symbolic language all can be helpful, but in IDL they come after experience, not before it. The interviewed perspective is allowed to define itself, or even to refuse definition altogether. Pause for a moment and notice your own habits here. When you encounter an unusual inner experience, a dream figure, a strong emotion, an intrusive thought, a sense present, do you automatically classify it? Do you tend to say, this is just part of me, or this is something other, or this must mean something? For this reality check, briefly reflect on how quickly you reach for an explanation. What happens if you imagine not knowing in advance what an experience is? What happens if you allow it to speak without assigning it a category? This is not about suspending critical thinking indefinitely, but about postponing interpretation long enough for something unexpected to emerge. You've also been introduced to why IDL grounds itself primarily in evolutionary systems and chaos theories rather than psychology alone. Psychology is powerful, but it is shaped by culture, history, and prevailing models of normality and pathology. Evolutionary principles operate at a deeper level. They describe processes of adaptation, organization, breakdown, and reorganization that apply across domains: biological, psychological, social, and cultural. From an IDL perspective, anything that persists over time must be adaptive in some way. Even symptoms, defenses, and seemingly dysfunctional patterns once served survival. The question is not whether they were useful, but whether they are still serving development. Take a moment to apply this lens to your own life. Is there a pattern you struggle with, emotional, relational, or cognitive, that may have once been adaptive? What might change if you approached it not as something broken, but as something shaped by evolutionary pressures that now needs renegotiation rather than elimination? Record or write a few lines about what stands out for you. You're not being asked to reach a conclusion, only to notice how suspending assumptions and adopting an evolutionary frame alters the way you listen. So you can hit the pause button, and then when you're ready, continue. The perspective interviewed in IDL are collectively referred to as emerging potentials. They are called potentials because their perspectives are less constrained by the ordinary limitations of waking life, such as linear time, survival anxiety, social scripting, and fixed identity. Interviewed perspectives often express priorities, values, or modes of functioning that are not yet integrated into the subject's waking life. In this sense, They represent evolutionary possibilities rather than psychological fragments. IDL does not assume that interviewed perspectives are purposeful, meaningful, intelligent, or even communicative. Humans naturally project these qualities onto experience, especially when it feels numinous or impactful. IDEO recognizes this tendency and deliberately refrains from reinforcing it. Instead, interviewed perspectives are allowed to define whether they experience themselves as meaningful, intelligent, purposeful, or communicative, or not. This restraint is essential to avoiding projection and metaphysical inflation. IDL interviewing can be applied to virtually any experience: dreams, nightmares, symptoms, life problems, historical figures, fictional characters, or current events. It is equally applicable to transpersonal experiences such as synchronicities, visitations, near-death experiences, psychic phenomena, or experiences of mystical unity. The method does not change based on the content. What matters is the capacity to enter and sustain the perspective being interviewed. IDL interviewing is as effective with young children as it is with adults, often more so. Children are generally less socialized and more comfortable shifting identity, which allows them to access interviewed perspectives with ease. The method has been used successfully with head-injured, addicted, and schizophrenic individuals, though effectiveness varies widely depending on comorbidities, stability, and support structures. Context and containment are always critical. In this reality check, think about how IDL has the perspectives that arise during interviewing called emerging potentials because they are not bound in the same way waking identity is. They are less constrained by linear time, survival pressure, social roles, or fixed notions of who we are supposed to be. This does not make them wiser or higher by definition. It simply means they operate under different conditions and therefore may reveal options, priorities, or orientations that waking identity cannot easily access. IDEO is careful not to assume that these perspectives are meaningful, intelligent, purposeful, or even trying to communicate. Humans habitually project meaning and intention onto impactful experiences, especially those that feel numinous or unusual. IDL deliberately resists this impulse. Interviewed perspectives are allowed to define themselves on their own terms, including the possibility that they experience themselves as neutral, mechanical, indifferent, or silent. This restraint is essential to avoiding projection and metaphysical inflation. Because IDL focuses on how one listens rather than what one listens to, the method applies across an unusually wide range of experiences. Dreams and nightmares are interviewed the same way as symptoms, life issues, historical figures, fictional characters, or current events. Transpersonal experiences, such as synchronicities, visitations, near-death experiences, or states of mystical unity, are approached with the same phenomenological discipline. The content does not determine the method. The capacity to enter and sustain a perspective does. For this reality check, pause and reflect on where you tend to add meaning to quickly. Are there experiences in your life that feel important, strange, or powerful, and that you immediately interpret as purposeful or instructive? What happens if you imagine listening without deciding in advance what the experience is or means? Pause the recording and write or record a brief reflection before continuing. Interviewed perspectives do not distinguish between waking and dreaming, self and other, or reality and fantasy in the way waking identity does. As a result, they naturally express transpersonal and non-dual perspectives. By suspending waking identity, these perspectives are given space to express themselves. Through identification with them, identity becomes broader and less rigid. This process is called empathetic multi-perspectivalism. Identity shifts from psychological geocentrism, the assumption that one's current identity is central, toward polycentrism, in which multiple perspectives are recognized as legitimate centers of experience. This shift more accurately mirrors cosmological reality, which has no single privileged center. Fear arises when the other is perceived as a threat. By becoming and including the other within identity, fear is reduced. As a result, anxiety, the most common and foundational mental health disorder, is often diminished. This includes panic disorders, phobias, PTSD symptoms, and recurrent nightmares. Interviewed perspectives in IDL do not organize experience around the distinctions that structure waking identity. They do not reliably separate waking from dreaming, self from other, or reality from fantasy. Because of this, they tend to express transpersonal and non-dual orientations naturally, without effort or belief. This does not make them superior, it simply reflects a different way of organizing experience when ordinary identity constraints are loosened. By temporarily suspending waking identity and becoming these perspectives, space is created for alternative worldviews to emerge. Identity becomes broader and less rigid, no longer confined to a single psychological center. IDEO refers to this shift as empathetic multi-perspectivalism, the capacity to inhabit multiple centers of experience without collapsing them into one dominant self. Identity moves from psychological geocentrism toward polycentrism, which more accurately reflects a universe without a privileged point of view. This expansion of identity has practical consequences. Fear arises when the other is experienced as alien, unpredictable, or threatening. When the other is included within identity through direct identification, its threatening quality often diminishes. What was once feared becomes intelligible, relatable, or at least familiar. As fear decreases, anxiety, which underlies many forms of psychological distress, is often reduced. This includes panic responses, phobias, post-traumatic reactivity, and recurrent nightmares. For this reality check, pause and notice where fear in your life is linked to rigid identity boundaries. Is there an other you consistently resist, avoid, or interpret as dangerous? What might change if that perspective were temporarily included rather than opposed? So pause here. You will deepen your learning if you write or record a brief reflection before moving on. IDL interviewing teaches empathy not as an idea, but as a lived capacity to inhabit another worldview. It assumes respect regardless of whether a perspective is considered internal, external, symbolic, or literal. Reciprocity is foundational. These qualities support trustworthiness, cooperation, and stable relationships. the basis of healthy social systems. Becoming alternative perspectives involves entering an altered state, even if briefly. While some experiential expansion remains, much is lost upon return to waking identity. Severe comorbidities, such as chronic depression combined with addiction or PTSD, can overwhelm the effectiveness of interviewing. Additionally, IDL does not work with those unwilling or unable to take on alternative perspectives. This inability is itself a diagnostic indicator. While interviewing can be used alone with IDL, it is designed to function within a broader practice called IDL Dream Yoga. Interviewing supports healing, balancing, and transformation, but its effectiveness increases dramatically when embedded within these contexts. Dream Yoga integrates meditation, pranayama, incubation, and discipline application. IDL interviewing does not work with those who cannot, will not, or do not take the perspectives of interviewed elements. A fundamental function of the interview is to help students and clients access interviewed perspective and maintain in its worldview during the interview. An inability or unwillingness of subjects to do so is a fundamental diagnostic indicator that IDL is not an appropriate intervention for them. While IDL interviewing can be used as a standalone intervention, it is meant to be used to facilitate a program of healing, balancing, and transformation that is called IDL Dream Yoga. That is because while interviewing facilitates an improved healing, balancing, and transformation, using it within those contexts greatly broadens its effectiveness. IDL interviewing teaches empathy not as a moral ideal or cognitive skill, but as a lived capacity to inhabit another worldview from the inside. Empathy here does not depend on whether a perspective is considered internal or external, symbolic or literal, psychological or transpersonal. Respect is assumed by default, not granted conditionally. This stance supports reciprocity, the recognition that relationship is mutual rather than extractive, which in turn underlies trustworthiness, cooperation, and the stability of healthy social systems. At the same time, IDL is realistic about its limits. Becoming alternative perspectives necessarily involves entering an altered state, even when that state is mild and temporary. While some expansion of identity and understanding may remain afterward, much of the immediacy and clarity fades as waking identity reasserts itself. IDL is not a permanent state change. It is a disciplined practice whose benefits depend on repetition, application, and integration. Effectiveness is also constrained by context and capacity. Severe comorbidity, such as chronic depression combined with addiction or unresolved trauma, can overwhelm the benefits of interviewing. Likewise, IDL does not work with individuals who cannot, will not, or refuse to take on alternative perspectives. This limitation is not a failure of the person, but a diagnostic indicator that IDL is not an appropriate intervention at that time. The ability to access and sustain the worldview of an interviewed perspective is foundational to the method. For this reason, IDL interviewing is designed to function within the broader practice of IDL Dream Yoga. While interviewing can be used as a standalone intervention, its effectiveness increases dramatically when embedded in a structured program of healing, balancing, and transformation. Dream Yoga integrates meditation, pranayama, incubation, and disciplined life application, providing continuity and depth that interviewing alone cannot sustain. For this reality check, reflect briefly. Where in your life might you benefit from practicing empathy as inhabitation rather than understanding? And where might limits, your own or others, be signaling the need for greater context and support? So pause the presentation at this point, write your comments, and continue when you're ready. IDL interviewing follows a clear structure designed to maximize clarity, reduce projection, and maintain perspective stability. While flexible, the structure provides containment and reproducibility. The following slides outline the major components. Naming 3 life issues grounds the interview in everyday relevance. Choosing a life issue, element, or dream nightmare or transpersonal element to interview. Stating associations. Why the subject thinks they had the experience. This is to surface and table assumptions so they do not contaminate the answers of the interviewed character. Associations are stated explicitly to surface assumptions and then set them aside so they do not contaminate the interview. Ask the element what it wants to be called, and then become it. The initial questions are designed to anchor awareness in the perspective of the character. Character, where are you? What are you doing? What are your strengths? What do you like most about yourself? What are your weaknesses? What do you dislike most about yourself? Ask the character, how are you most similar to your human? This question establishes relationship and relevance. It is not meant to imply the character is an aspect of the person, although it may be. The question could just as easily be asked, character, how is your human most similar to you? Initial questions anchor awareness in the interviewed perspective. Strengths and weaknesses humanize the perspective and stabilize identification. Asking the character, if you could change in any way you wanted, would you change or would you stay the same? The purpose of this question is to create space for both transformation and clarity about why the character chooses not to change. In either case, it is important that the decision is that of the interviewed perspective and not what the dreamer or subject wants, although those may coincide. These questions establish relevance without assuming identity equivalence. Transformation is invited, but not imposed. IDL interviewing follows a clear and deliberate structure, not to restrict experience, but to protect it. The structure is designed to maximize clarity, reduce projection, and maintain stability of perspective once identification occurs. While the interview remains flexible and responsive, this scaffolding provides containment and reproducibility, allowing insights to be tested, compared, and integrated over time. What follows in the next slides are not arbitrary steps, but safeguards that keep the process grounded and phenomenologically clean. The interview begins by naming 3 current life issues. This step anchors the process in everyday relevance and prevents the interview from drifting into abstraction or spiritual bypass. From there, a specific element is chosen to interview: a dream figure, nightmare presence, life issue, or transpersonal experience. Before becoming the element, the subject states their associations about why they think the experience occurred. These associations are not wrong or discouraged. They are simply surfaced and then set aside so they do not contaminate the answers of the interviewed perspective. The interview proper begins by asking the element what it wants to be called and then becoming it. Initial questions such as where are you and what are you doing anchor awareness in the lived world of the experience of the perspective. Questions about strengths and weaknesses humanize the perspective and stabilize identification, preventing inflation or dissociation. These questions are not psychological analysis. They are orienting moves that help the perspective speak from itself rather than being spoken about. Relevance is then established without collapsing identity. Asking, how are you most similar to your human? Builds relationship without assuming the element is an aspect of the self. This can be reversed just as easily, reinforcing reciprocity rather than hierarchy. Finally, the question of change is introduced. Character. If you could change in any way you wanted, would you change or stay the same? Transformation is invited but never imposed. Whether the perspective chooses change or continuity, the priority is that the decision belongs to the interviewed perspective, not the waking personality. For this reality check, consider how often in your life do you invite change without coercion? And how often do you decide to advance what should change? The next series of 6 questions are optional and are not for children, but are nevertheless helpful. Their purpose is to raise awareness of the breadth of quality within different interviewed perspectives, to raise awareness regarding these core qualities, many of which are not emphasized by culture or society, and to recognize that different combinations of them can be most effective in different life circumstances. Here's the first of the 6 questions. Character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in confidence? Why? A character that gives themselves a 0 or a 1 in confidence indicates fear. A character that gives themselves a 9 to 10 indicates fearlessness. The second question. Character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in compassion? Why? 0 to 1 in compassion indicates indifference. 9 to 10 at the other end of the scale indicates selfless caring. The third core quality. Character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in wisdom? Why? 0 to 1 in wisdom indicates being out of flow with life. A 9 or a 10 indicates being in flow. The next question is character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in acceptance? Why? A 0 to 1 answer is acceptance. In acceptance indicates high rejection. A 9 or a 10 indicates high acceptance. The fifth question is character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in inner peace? Why? A 0 to 1 in inner peace indicates chronic stress, while a 9 to 10 indicates constant equanimity. The sixth and final of these core quality profile questions is character. How do you score yourself 0 to 10 in witnessing? Why? A 0 to 1 in witnessing indicates profound subjectivity. 9 to 10 indicates extreme objectivity. High scores are not necessarily better than low ones. Each interviewed element will have its own profile of scores and its own reasons for them, which are quite instructive. Here's our reality check. This series of 6 questions is optional and generally not used with children, yet it provides a uniquely clarifying lens into the internal ecology of interviewed perspectives. These questions are not diagnostic tools and are not intended to measure health, maturity, or virtue. Their purpose is threefold. First, to reveal the breadth of qualitative variation across different perspectives. Second, to draw attention to core qualities that are often undervalued or unevenly emphasized by culture. And third, to demonstrate that different constellations of qualities may be optimally adaptive in different life contexts. Each quality, confidence, compassion, wisdom, acceptance, inner peace, and witnessing, represents a fundamental dimension of functioning. By asking the interviewed perspective to score itself and explain why, authority shifts away from waking assumptions and toward the internal logic of that perspective. The explanations are far more informative than the numerical scores. They illuminate how a perspective understands its role, limitations, and adaptive purpose within the broader system of the person's life. A crucial principle of IDL is that high scores are not inherently superior to low ones. A perspective low in compassion may be effective in crisis or boundary enforcement. A perspective low in inner peace may be mobilized for urgent action. A perspective low in witnessing may be deeply embodied and relational. Each profile reflects specialization rather than deficiency. IDL treats these differences as instructive rather than problematic. This sequence trains discernment rather than self-improvement. It helps interviewees recognize that wisdom often lies not in maximizing a single virtue, but in learning when and how to access the right configuration of qualities for the situation at hand. Pause the presentation now and consider what you've heard. Does it make sense? What questions does it raise? How can it apply in your life? And when you're ready, we'll continue. The interviewed character is asked, if you were in charge of my life, would you live it differently? If so, how? Answers provide different possible approaches to life to consider, as well as possibly generating recommendations which can be operationalized to test the utility of the method and build confidence and trust. The character is asked, if you were in charge of my life, how would you deal with each of my 3 life issues? Different approaches to problem solving may be provided that generate opportunities to apply recommendations as part of an ongoing dream yoga, establishing a developmental partnership with emerging potentials. The character is then asked, are there times or situations in my life when you would recommend I become you and deal with them the way you do? This answer provides a third way in which the relevance of IDL interviewing can be tested as part of a dream yoga to see if it provides healing, balancing, or transformation. Optionally, the character can be asked, why do you think I had this dream or nightmare or life issue or transpersonal experience? This response, along with the others, reflects the interpretations of relatively detached perspectives, which at the same time are in a position to be intrinsically engaged with the subject's life experience. It reflects a basic priority of IDL. Interpretations by interviewed elements precede those of the subject and the coach, caregiver, or clinician. These questions generate actionable recommendations and invite experimentation. IDL prioritizes interpretations from interviewed perspectives, reducing projection and authority bias. At the conclusion of the interview, the subject is asked, what did you hear? This step is essential to integrate the perspective of the other into waking awareness after the interview. This, combined with receiving a copy of the interview transcript to read over before sleep, are ways to offset the natural tendency for waking awareness to revert to habitual life scripting. After the perspective and the interviewed subject have been heard, the interviewer may add their own perspective, if desired by the subject. Healing, balancing, and transformation are rarely the result of insight. They require discipline and ongoing application. This awareness and emphasis is what makes IDL a yoga. That it treats a life experience as dreamlike makes it a dream yoga. Because these perspectives typically provide higher order transpersonal integration, the process is sacred as well as secular. IDL is based on disciplined application because that is the only way to validate it, and more importantly, integrate and evolve personal and collective life. To that end, interviewed individuals are asked to choose one recommendation from the interview that they would like to test in their lives. They are then taught to operationalize it using the SMARTER formula, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-based, evaluate, and reward. Partnering with their interviewer or a fellow student for weekly follow-up and accountability is designed to maintain focus and build a support community of like-minded individuals, which IDL calls a Sangha, a Buddhist word for sacred community. Healing, balancing, and transformation is typically hit and miss as we follow the recommendations of this or that parent, teacher, mentor, boss, or guru. IDL emphasizes taking up the dream yoga of growth and partnership with the recommendations of interviewed emerging potentials in order to align life goals with the priorities of one's own life compass. Life compass is a hypothesized set of innate priorities that are attempting to emerge as organic evolutionary expressions. The further assumption is that to do so moves one toward Wu Wei, a Taoist concept of effortless flow with intrinsic personal and collective evolution. This does not imply ease or the absence of life challenges or tragedies, but it does imply ongoing access to tools and perspectives that are uniquely equipped to handle them with grace. That ongoing commitment is most likely to bear fruit if one interviews others on a regular basis. This is not only a way to further test the method, but to speed one's own development. It does so because others represent aspects of ourselves. As we treat them, so we are treating those aspects of ourselves that they represent. Therefore, if we show them how to access their own emerging potentials and life compass, if we show others how to do so, we are at the same time expanding our own ability to do the same. Therefore, interviewing of others is a basic aspect of the IDL healing, balancing, and transformative curriculum that addresses the healing of life scripts, toxic life drama, and thought patterns. It builds greater life balance by aligning life goals with the priorities of life compass, as discovered through interviewing, as well as by developing assertiveness and superior problem-solving ability. It supports genuine, lasting transformation by teaching effective meditation, pranayama, and pre-sleep dream incubation. After qualitative profiling, the interview shifts toward application. The interviewed perspective is asked whether it would live the subject's life differently if it were in charge, and if so, how. This question opens space for alternative strategies without assuming that change is required or desirable. Some perspectives will recommend transformation, others will articulate why stability or continuity is preferable. In either case, agency remains with the interviewed perspective rather than the waking self. The next question deepens relevance by asking how the interviewed perspective would deal with each of the subject's three life issues. These responses frequently generate concrete, testable approaches to problem solving that differ markedly from habitual strategies. On other occasions, you may find that this or that interview perspective has no interest or idea about how to deal with a particular life issue. It's simply not in its realm of experience. In IDL, these answers are treated not as truths to believe, but as hypotheses to test within lived experience. A third application question asks whether there are specific situations in which the subject would benefit from becoming this perspective and responding as it would. This creates an embodied pathway for integration. Instead of merely learning about the perspective, the subject experiments with becoming it when appropriate, allowing its adaptive intelligence to operate directly. Optionally, the perspective may be asked why it believes the experience occurred. This interpretation is not privileged because it is true, but because it originates from a relatively detached, yet intrinsically engaged, vantage point. A foundational IDL principle is that interpretations by interviewed perspectives precede those of the subject, coach, or clinician, thereby reducing projection and authority. IDL explicitly prioritizes interpretations from interviewed perspectives over those of the waking self or facilitator. This sequencing is deliberate. It minimizes projection, reduces theoretical contamination, and preserves phenomenological integrity. At the conclusion of the interview, the subject is asked a deceptively simple question. What did you hear? This step is essential. It invites waking identity to listen rather than reinterpret and to integrate the perspective of the other into conscious awareness. Reviewing a transcript of the interview, especially before sleep, further supports integration and counters the natural tendency of waking awareness to revert to habitual scripting. Only after both the interviewed perspective and the subject have been fully heard may the interviewer offer reflections, and only if requested. This preserves autonomy, reinforces reciprocity, and maintains the non-authoritarian stance central to IDL. Healing, balancing, and transformation rarely result from insight alone. They require discipline, repetition, and application. This is what makes IDL a yoga rather than a technique, or simply a therapeutic intervention. By treating all life experiences as dreamlike, interpretable, fluid, and responsive to awareness, IDL becomes a form of dream yoga. Because interviewed perspectives often express transpersonal integration, the process is both sacred and secular without relying on metaphysical belief. IDL emphasizes disciplined application because it is the only way to validate the method and integrate its benefits into lived life. Interviewees are therefore asked to select one recommendation from an interview and operationalize it using the SMARTER framework: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-based, evaluate, and reward. Weekly accountability with an interviewer or peer sustains focus and builds what IDL refers to as a Sangha, a community of shared practice. Most people pursue growth episodically, following the advice of parents, teachers, mentors, or cultural authorities. IDL offers an alternative, an ongoing developmental partnership with one's own emerging potentials. This partnership aligns life goals with what IDL calls the life compass, a hypothesized set of innate evolutionary priorities seeking expression. IDL supports the development of two sanghas. One's interior intrasocial sangha of interviewed perspectives, and one's exterior social cultural sangha of other students of IDL Dream Yoga. We need both. Following a life compass does not eliminate difficulty or tragedy. Instead, it provides ongoing access to perspectives and practices capable of meeting life's challenges with flexibility and grace. This orientation echoes the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, not effortlessness, but alignment with intrinsic flow. Regularly interviewing others is a core component of this commitment. Others function as mirrors and extensions of ourselves. As we help them access their own emerging potentials, we simultaneously expand our own capacity to do the same. For this reason, interviewing others is not ancillary, but central to the IDL curriculum. It supports healing by loosening toxic scripts, balancing by aligning goals with intrinsic priorities, and transformation by a grounding meditation, pranayama, and dream incubation in lived relational reality. So take a moment to pause, to gather your thoughts, to write down what you've heard that's important to you, and then when you're ready, let's continue. The final part is a 10-question self-test, just in order to evaluate for yourself what you've heard, to review major concepts, and to provide a marker for you to continue on to the next part of your journey into learning integral deep listening.